Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Universal Church of Truth, episode 5. We're talking about the latest edition of Marvel Studios' Moon Knight, um, aptly titled Asylum. Mary, this episode is so good. I liked it a lot. I liked a lot of what it did with the characters. I think this is it's been fantastic acting throughout, but this is like some of the best acting that I personally think we've seen in the show so far. I would love to get your overall thoughts. I know this was my first time seeing it was this morning, but I know that you got a chance to see it ahead of time and then rewatch it today. So I would love to hear your kind of overall thoughts before we start dissecting.
Yeah. Well, yeah, like you said, I think we can talk about it now, but the episode 5 got released to the press on accident for like an hour or so, and I happened to get to see it. So it's been hard, like, not to talk about it, because that was several weeks ago, but, because first it was hard not to talk about episode 4, and then sorry. But I loved it. I do. I mean, it reminded me, obviously, a lot of WandaVision's second to last episode, the whole, like, memory. It's like answering a lot of questions you've had you didn't know about the show. I thought this one was better. I think part of it is there's a lot more going on. I know it was sad. Like it was very
It's a sad episode.
yeah, how it made you feel sad. Like a lot of things are sad, but they really did. But I loved it. I really did. There's no Moon Knight. There's no Mr. Knight. None of that. There's a memory of Khonshu briefly kind of thing, but despite that, I didn't really notice. I loved it, but that's yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like something we talked a little bit about last week too. Was just this idea that this show, despite obviously it's titled Moon Knight for obvious reasons, because it's about that comic book character and that's the name brand, but really this is a show about Mark and Steven, and I feel like week after week they just keep proving that that's true, and not only is it true, but it is the reason that people are watching this show is because Oscar Isaac, Mark, Steven, these characters, like this is what is really interesting. I know towards the end of the episode there's like that little fight on the big undead ship, right? And like it's a fun little action scene, and you have Mark and Steven. Steven kind of gets like a moment to shine action wise, which is really cool. Which we can get more into in a minute. But I actively said out loud to my roommate who was watching with me, like it would have been so cool if we had like if this was like Moon Knight and Mr. Knight kind of like fighting side by side on this ship. But then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I'm so glad that it's not that, because when you strip away like the cool costumes and all of that stuff, then it becomes more character based, and the moment starts to have so much more meaning because you're not focusing on, oh, look how cool this is. It's like, oh, what is the meaning of what is really happening here? um but yeah, let's dig into this episode. Let's start dissecting. Talking about meaning. This is the origin episode. This is where we more or less we kind of see everything that happened before the show started. We get a lot of answers we've been asking questions about. Um, for example, it is confirmed that, as we suspected, Mark is the original body. um, we get those flashbacks to Chicago, um, to his childhood with an abusive mother, the whole 9 yards. But what I wanted to ask you about, because you are our resident Moon Knight comic book expert, um, the origin that we are given in this show, how much of that is spot on from the comics and how much of that is just inspired by the comics?
Okay. First thing I'm going to mention is the Moon Knight origin with Khonshu's statue on. He doesn't die. I think that that's really significant. He's
Right.
not revived, and it could just be like practical, like he's talking to Khonshu, so like if he's dead, it's a little hard for him to have that conversation. But I think that's at least symbolically meaningful. So that though pretty much is straight from the comics. I mean, in the original version, like Marlene was there with him in that part, but other parts didn't have that. That was all the same. The Tomb Raider, Bushman, right? The dissociative identity disorder stuff is significantly different than the comics, but it's more recent. But they did that like 2016ish. In the comics, essentially, a family friend who was in this Jewish community turned out to be like a Nazi serial killer, torturer guy, like a basement.
Yeah.
It's like
as one does.
Yeah, and so Mark like stumbles upon him, finds this out, and he's like chased by him and he gets away. But then that character, that Nazi serial killer guy, comes back later on in some other weird comic, to be honest. But so a lot of people talk about how his origin with that is very much based in his Jewish history, which I get because obviously it's very related. But that was kind of a newer, and it was like a reveal in the comics. They hadn't touched on that at all before. But as we know, in the episode, it's his mom and it's the death of his brother, and his mom blames him. And whoever wrote that mom character and the actress as well, phenomenal. I mean, you take these shows like this that are very action based. You don't typically see like trauma like that coming from just a normal, non-superpowered woman, like, and in that kind of figure to a kid. Like, she was brutal, and you just don't see that as much. And I think that was part of why it hit so hard, because it seemed honestly a bit more realistic, because it was different, but it wasn't like at all outside the realm of possibility in people's lives. But damn, I thought that was really well done. But so yes, so the series took out, well, didn't take out, they changed it. It just didn't have that very different, brutal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you said. I think you mentioning that it is what happened to Mark in the MCU is like within the realm of possibility of someone watching this, someone watching the show, someone like that's something that unfortunately happens to real people all the time, and it is brutal. Like for example, I went to see The Northman last night, right? And The Northman has some really brutal, like violent, just scenes where you're like taken aback and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they would put that on a screen. Um, Maybe some people will say that this is hyperbole or whatnot, but there were like moments in this episode of Moon Knight that were harder for me to watch than some of the like excessive gore in The Northman, because it's so hard as a person to see another human being be so like rejected by the person who's supposed to be like caring for them and loving for them, and that is so deeply traumatic and troubling to see. I mean, I was putting the pieces together watching it. He goes off with his brother, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that Mark had a brother. And then I was like, oh, I get it. They like go into the cave, and I was like, oh no, he's gonna die. And then I was expecting the death of his brother to be like the traumatic event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not the traumatic event being that after his brother died, his mother blamed him for it, treated him terribly the rest of his life, her life, and his father, perhaps more so, his father didn't do anything to stop it. Like his dad just let it happen and kept making excuses, which is almost worse, that he didn't, like, the other parent just was an enabler in the whole situation, and like that sort of sucks as well. But I think it was deeply affecting, and I think that um maybe taking out the like, just at the very least, and like you said, not taking out, just making it so relatable was so effective for me. But yeah, I think it was beautifully written. Like you said, the actress, it was so good, and just like the way they told that story with jumping in and out of it, non-linear, revealing things, almost like this Tarantino-esque, like we're everywhere in the timeline, and then you don't really know what's going on, and then like he's in the psych ward, and he's like, you got to be open with Steven, and that everything. It was all really, really good, and I really, really liked it. It confirms the Stephen Grant comes, that movie was real, like within the MCU, and it was one that he watched and enjoyed. And that reveal is handled really well with the Stephen character. I think him realizing that he's fake, because I had made a note in my phone sorry, I know I'm talking a lot in one section, but like he had made a note in his phone, in my phone, about it's interesting that Steven remembers parts of the childhood and the room, but not the mom being terrible. And it did take a second for that to click with me, that it was because, Steven was created for the moments when the mother wasn't being abusive. So they're, hiding it or whatnot. I just thought that whole thing was so good.
Yeah. No, I love it. I never questioned, I mean, part of the comics and then just the way the episodes play out, but I never questioned that Mark wasn't the original. But in this episode, it's probably the first time I was really like into that kind of tease and that mystery of it. Because for Ethan Hawke's character, I still don't care about him like that much, but he is great. Like the acting,
Yeah, in this, it's so good.
Yeah, he was very good in this episode. But I think one of the things he said, not exact, obviously, but Mark, do you think you created Steven to like escape, or Steven, do you think you created Mark to punish your mother? And I was like, damn, like that's such an interesting way to look at it, even if you kind of like know who is who. But it speaks to their two different personalities anyway, regardless of who's the original. Like they act in such different ways. And I did wonder early on, and this was kind of confirmed, if Mark was like taking care of Steven, not like directly, but like keeping him relatively safe. He doesn't know anything about these things. It's very simple, okay life, for the most part. And it seems kind of confirmed in this that Mark was kind of actively in some way doing that a little bit. Like he obviously didn't tell him about the mom passing. But I don't know. Like clearly he was set up in some way, and Mark never went out of his way to ruin that for him. So it kind of
there's the scene that really sticks out for me is when Steven is first about to see the abuse, like the physical abuse from the mother. And Mark pulls him out and is not even being subtle about it. He literally says, like, you're not supposed to see that. That's the whole point of you, is that like you exist so that I don't have to think about this. Basically.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's exactly what you're saying, is like that's why he was protecting Steven, because as long as he's protecting Steven, he's protecting himself. And I think that's it again, like so deeply affecting to just see like a human being so desperate for emotional comfort like that. And I think that I feel like we mentioned in previous episodes that Steven felt like the more interesting character, like, and that's why they focus so much on Steven, because Mark is just like cold-hearted mercenary guy who keeps lying to his girl or wife, not even girl, I keep forgetting they're married, his wife. And Steven was like the fun British guy, like figuring it all out. And in this episode, Mark just becomes like so much more, so different than all these other like Marvel protagonists and all of that. Like after this episode, the way that we look at Mark Spector is not the same.
Right. No, exactly. And I mean, I love it. I just think the thing I think is so interesting, and part of my whole he didn't die under the statue thing, is I think like WandaVision, the finale of WandaVision, she becomes the Scarlet Witch. It's kind of like the MCU specific origin for her. Like that's what we think of when we think of Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch moment in the MCU. And I kind of think they're doing that here. I mean, obviously they haven't introduced them before, but I think they're like purposefully like mentioning the whole statue resurrection thing, like, oh, yep, that's how it happened. We don't really care. Whatever's going to happen in the finale, I think is going to be like the Moon Knight moment, far more importantly than like the original Khonshu connection. I think there's a lot more, as we know, going on now, and I think he's going to like come to terms with more so with who he is and what he wants to do in Moon Knight, or however. I think it's going to be much more. I think it's going to be better than had we just like led up to the whole statue thing. So I think that's fun. And I like that. It's different. I don't know how they're going to do it. I've read a lot of comics. Like I have no idea what they're going to do next episode. Kind of fun. Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I agree with you, and I really am. Again, referencing last week, you had mentioned, um, that well, it was a private conversation, but you had mentioned to me that um, you weren't sure how they were going to get into episode 6 and like close it all up based on the ending of 5.
Mhm.
And having seen the episode, I wholeheartedly agree with you. Like, I have no idea where this is going. Like, I don't know how this finishes up. I mean, at the end of episode 5, Mark is still dead. Like, he's still dead. He's not only is he still dead, but he has completed his journey to the actual afterlife. Like, he's not even. It's not even like, oh, he's still in limbo. It's like, no, he's dead, dead. And not only is he dead, dead, but he came to terms with his past to a point that, both literally and metaphorically, he no longer has Steven. Like, Steven is the one who fell off the boat, and his soul didn't make it to the afterlife. He's stuck in the Duat, I believe they called it. Um, and obviously that's because he fell off the boat in the fight, but that, that probably represents the fact that, having looked and confronted his wounds, Mark doesn't like need Steven to be protecting him anymore. Um, Yada yada yada. But yeah, I have no idea how he gets pulled out of the afterlife, and how, I'm assuming Steven comes back. Maybe Steven is gone and they replace Steven with Jake Lockley for some reason. Like, I don't know how this is all going to play out. Um, I will say, like you saying with WandaVision, how she had existed and functioned as essentially a Scarlet Witch for a long time, and then what happened in WandaVision is what turns her into the Scarlet Witch, as we know. This could be a similar thing. Like, if Mark didn't die before, this time he did die.
Because in fact, this is his resurrection.
And
Norman
this is the comic book resurrection,
kind of a
where
more,
he becomes Moon Knight as we know him in the comics.
yeah.
So yeah.
I will say, so with the whole, I have a lot to say. I have a really great Jake Lockwood theory.
Please spit it all out.
Well, I will, because I really enjoy it. If it happens, I'm going to congratulate myself a lot. But first, and it's related. So the scales balancing thing kind of confuses me. Maybe it's just me overthinking it. But so, like you said, there's very much the metaphorical. He came to terms with it. Steven's gone,
Right.
so he's more of his own self.
Right.
I get that. But if Jake does exist, which it seems like he does because of the sarcophagus, that makes me think it's already there.
The perpetual. It seems like he's there, even if we haven't seen him.
The thing, not something that's like going to come out of thin air, right? And also he beat up people in the Black Tower, So if he's there, he's there. Like, how does it balance if Mark still has that going on? I have that question about it, but what I think is really interesting, so Steven, died, because he died with the body, and then he died in the sands, and then Mark died, and made it to the afterlife. No, but the only person who hasn't died is Jake. So, right. My theory, which again, I think would be super cool, is when they're resurrected from the tomb that they died in, he's going to be the one who's, in control and the personality of the body, because he isn't dead. And eventually, there's always this theme in the comics of when they do sort of get rid of personalities, a lot of them are like, we hate Mark Spector, he's gone. They always come back. I don't know how they deal with that, and I think that's, how they would eventually come with that. But I think it'd be cool if that was sort of early on in the episode, and that's Jake's reveal, and we don't expect it, because, Mark comes up and it's like, oh, there he is, and he doesn't say anything, and then out of nowhere, he just, murders people. That'd be really cool.
He just walks right over to Harrow and murders him off the bat.
Which I can see. I don't think he's, and that's like you said. How are they gonna? What are they doing next episode? Because the plot we had basically stopped towards the end of episode 4. It's the guy, and they haven't advanced it at all.
And we know from this episode that while he's been dead, time didn't stop, because Harrow is now doing his mission, right?
Yeah, they're on the side. They're like, oh yeah, there's a bunch of people dying.
Yeah.
Which, if that many people are dying at that time, he's really doing something. What's also interesting, I think, is the gates of Osiris. They made it to them a lot quicker than Colorette had ever seen. So I think there's some like outside influence going on, whether it's Hantu, who may or may not still be in prison, or the other gods we've seen. Not exactly sure what, but like something else was going on there, I think, because there's just too many like random like why, like why.
Yeah, there's just a lot of like, if even the like Egyptian goddess who's been doing this for eternity is confused, like something is going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's but yeah, like we haven't even touched the plot that we had before. So how are they going to resolve that one in an episode plus whatever we've just kind of built up?
Yeah.
Not even episode and a half, episode or something. But yeah, so it's kind of fun. No idea what they're going to do.
Yeah.
Seems like they have to do a lot, but
I do like that theory. I do like the episode, like the idea of the next episode starting with like Mark's body coming up out of the water and it's just Jake and they're like, what is going on? He's got like a goofy like New York cabbie accent for no reason. They're like, what is happening? Yeah, it's funny that they keep teasing Jake and not revealing him, and like I don't know what they're doing with that. I know like I've seen some people online talk about how even in this episode they're like, oh well, in this quick little scene, like Oscar Isaac's accent sounds a little like New Yorkish, and so that means he was Jake Lockley for like these like 2 seconds, and then he switched. But I feel like that can't be true because every time we've seen whenever he switches between Mark and Steven, it's like a whole like his eyes roll back in his head and then he like blacks out and like that's a whole thing. So I feel like there's no way he's just casually like popping in and out of Jake like that.
Yeah. The only thing that would make sense, I mean, other than that's how they wanted to write it, the only thing that would make sense is if Jake was not already his own thing. He was like found this piece of Mark that's going to like branch off and become personality. I don't think that's the case because of the blackouts and
Right.
the sarcophagus. Love that sarcophagus.
Well, and speaking of that sarcophagus, real quick too, like that is on the boat.
Mm-hmm.
So like what, like that, like that's another question that's just left unanswered. Is
he's just there. So something's happening with that. Like there is like at this point, Oscar Isaac, every interview he's doing now, as you know, is like
yeah.
But I was really surprised when I watched this episode and Jake wasn't in it at all. Like, even at the end, like a reveal, like, ooh, Jake, nothing. So it's like,
yeah. Well, they just teased him so hard for it to like not be a thing in this episode. It has to be in the last one, and if it's not in the last one, then this is just Mephisto all over again.
The one thing I could see is it's like almost like an epilogue of the last one, and then you would pick on going
like
forward.
That's the Moon Knight post-credit scene. Is Jake?
Yeah, I wouldn't love that because they have teased it so hard. It'd be cool to get at least like a minute, like street time with him, or else you don't really know his personality or anything about him. You don't give him
right
a second, like a real reveal. But they really do. It seems like, and I think that that's the point of the series in a lot of ways. We don't know what is or isn't like real, or what's really going on. But it seems like they have a lot to do in the finale. How are they going to do that much? I don't know. It's a little scary. But I think realistically, I think we're going to find out some of it's just not what we thought. Some of it's not the big deal.
Well, I mean,
choose the bad guy. Who knows about that?
I think you're probably onto something. I mean, even so, Tarwell Rhett is saying, this is the an afterlife, which, by the way, that was really cool. This is a little ancestral plane shout out. I feel like we can't go a whole church episode and not talk about that and the implications that has, but we'll get back to that in 1 second. Like even after she's saying like, yeah, this is like an afterlife and you're dead and you're on your way to, this version of the afterlife, yada, yada, yada. Even after she says all that, the show is still doing its best to convince us that like Mark is in a mental hospital, and it doesn't really clear that up in this either. Like he still has flashes to being in a mental hospital where this Ethan Hawke Dr. Harrow is like no, you are having psychotic breaks, and like we're not sedating you, even though we saw them sedate him and like all this stuff, and they don't clear that up, and that's very much part of like the Moon Knight DNA, is to like have stuff like that just kind of goes unexplained and have people question forever and ever like just how crazy is this guy. But yeah, I mean, there's got to be some sort of reconciliation with all of this before it ends, because they can't end with like nothing.
Yeah.
um but yeah, so um going back really quick to the ancestral plane thing, what are your thoughts on that? Because I think it's really cool that they kind of just straight up were like, all of the, I mean, it's very much in line with the comics, and it's similar to like, we know that multiple pantheons of gods exist in this universe. Like, we know that the Asgardians exist. We now know that the Egyptian gods exist. You know, the trailer for Love and Thunder, we know that the like Olympus and like those gods all exist. And just Taro straight up being like, yeah, like the ancestral plane is a thing, and like this is a thing, and like, there's just like a million different afterlives, and this is just the one you kind of ended up in because it's the one that you like interact with and believe in, and all that fun stuff. Um, I feel like that does kind of have big implications for the future of the MCU. In like one little line, it's just that, okay, well, like now we know for a fact that they're not going to be taking all these religions and trying to find a way that they can all exist at once, and they're just going to straight up say like, yep, anything is on the table, all of it's there. They just exist in different dimensions and realities and realms and yada yada yada.
Mm-hmm.
So,
No, I
what are your
think
thoughts on this?
yeah. So I think it's really cool because in a lot of ways, Black Panther sometimes feels very on its own in the MCU, and we know it's not, but right, they have the ancestral plane. That's very different than anything we've seen, and it doesn't really connect with a lot of the other kind of supernaturals, right, in this situation. But those kind of elements, and so the fact that very casually, they
Mm-hmm.
connected a lot and just made it all make a lot more sense in terms of like what's happening in the MCU at large. I think that's really cool, and it makes sense that it's the ancestral plane because of the different elements going on, like Bast, the god that's kind of over there, started off in the Ennead with these Egyptian gods, so like that makes sense, but I think there is a broader impact when they do connect something like Black Panther to everything else. Because if you connect, I don't know, Doctor Strange again, sure, but like we've seen that a million times. So it does bring a much more, it brings a more well-rounded approach to all that was kind of just on its own before. And it really just, I think, like you said, just all at once in one line, like expanded how we understand the whole universe. I think that is very cool.
Of course. And speaking of Marvel Universe, and we were talking about his origin and references and yada yada yada, there was another really cool name drop in this episode in the flashbacks, um, that I think that we all assumed before, but it is kind of nice to have straight up confirmation. Is that his partner who betrayed him and shot him and yada 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 is in fact Bushman.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, which I thought was really cool.
Mm-hmm. I wonder because I mean and I think like the writers and the director spoke on why they didn't use him as
Mm-hmm.
like the principal villain, because in the comics like he is the principal Moon Knight villain. I mean he obviously the origin right after the origin comes Moon Knight, there's a whole little arc there, and then more recently he rips his face off. That's a whole thing. Khonshu looks like the Bushman with his face ripped off for a while. Actually, it may not have been Khonshu. It may have been Mars.
Like
It gets iffy in there too. But
as manifesting as.
yeah. So he's a very important character traditionally in Moon Knight. But they said they were avoiding him. One of the quotes was that he was too much like Killmonger, and they wanted to avoid that. I don't know if I like fully agree with that. I'm not the expert Killmonger though. But so I didn't know if they were just avoiding him because they didn't want him at all. So the fact that they did name drop him, I think speaks to they might have plans for some of these like traditional characters going in the future. It might not. It could just be like, hey, we know what it is. Like we Brooklyn. But they've set up enough that if they wanted to, if there is another Moon Knight story down the line, that's more solo, which maybe is less likely than team ups and stuff, but they have.
So it's little name drops like that that really make me want a second season of this show, just because, I know they keep saying that it's a mini series and that Oscar Isaac only signed on for like one set of things, yada yada. But I mean, with the reception they've had of it and all these like remaining plot threads, I would much rather have a season 2 than like have things wrapped up in like team up situations. But yeah, I mean, it makes me it's nice to have confirmation that Bushman, however you want to say it, Bushman is a little more comic-y. It does make it sound like he has really lame superpowers though, but Bushman is like one of the Moon Knight guys, like you said. So it feels like if they do continue telling Moon Knight's story, I mean, unless they say, okay, he just died there in the Egyptian desert, like maybe Mark got him like on his way down or something. But other than if that's not the case, which I feel like they haven't said that yet, unless I completely missed it, then Bushman is still out there, and it feels like that's got to be a thing that they like want to tie up at a certain point. I'm with you where I feel like he's not that similar to Killmonger that they couldn't use him. I do kind of like everything they're. I get why, like, story wise and thematically, Harrow makes more sense for like the type of story they wanted to tell. But Bushman, like, maybe it's just because him and Killmonger are both sort of like mercenaries who are more violent than like their heroic counterparts or something.
Yeah.
He's like radicalized or something. But it makes me feel like if we do ever get like a Moon Knight versus Bushman confrontation down the line, it's going to be a radically different version of Bushman, unless the other writers decide it's fine to just keep him the same. But my guess is we'll get some sort of like an amalgamation. Like the MCU likes to do that. Like they'll combine him with a different Moon Knight villain, so it's like he has the same name, but he's like a totally different character or something along those lines. I don't really know if Moon Knight has any other villains that would like tie in really well with Bushman, but
like a lot of them are pretty chill. Like they're not like these crazy tons of powers type people. Like in episode 3, we got Midnight Man. We got the character's name. We obviously don't call him Midnight Man, but there were a lot of similarities, and he got like hit. And I know the actor is that's right, but the character wasn't like clearly killed or like like he could easily still be out there as well. Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's interesting. So, I mean, what they're doing with Ethan Hawke's Arthur Faro, they obviously took a name from a very, very obscure, like more obscure than El Muerto.
I was just thinking the same thing. I was like, it's like
yeah, like one issue, way back in the day. But he has so many. I wrote an article about it. I don't know, probably like week 1. There's so many similarities between some of the, particularly more recent Moon Knight villains. Like a lot. Like even Dr. Emmett in the Lemire run, obviously he looks like that in this mental institution situation. She was connected to Amit, and the Sun King guy, he had a very culty, super culty, like that whole. And he mentions. I thought it was interesting. It was in the 4th. I don't think we talked about it, but on that point, he like goes out of his way to mention that he has like a history with what seems like bipolar. So he talks about like manic eyes and like depressive lows. And the Sun King, that was like his reasoning for being in the mental institution he was at the beginning, like why he was. I just thought that was interesting that they seemed to be connecting it. It doesn't seem a little too specific, but yeah, I think it's possible that these characters like Bushman are still there, or at least they're saving it if they want to, because they didn't touch on a lot of his classic stuff in this, and I think it's really good. I'm not complaining. A lot of his classic stuff is like the standard, I guess. So it would be cool if they were able to do that, change him enough that he's still kind of an authentic villain for Moon Knight, but it's a bit more interesting, dynamic in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that really does feel like the route they're going. Like you just kind of everything you just said with Harrow essentially being an original villain who's actually like four different Moon Knight villains in one character. Um which is really cool. I feel like Bushman will be like a similar thing if they ever get to him. Um but yeah, I really do I feel like you and I are onto something with all these like WandaVision comparisons of like building up towards because even I had another thought watching that fight scene on the boat where Steven picks up like the baseball bat and or the wood or whatever it was and starts like hammering away at these super by the way that room where he walks in and it's just like a bunch of like everyone he's killed but they're zombies like that was also really dark. That was crazy. But when Steven starts like hammering away, like from some of the Moon Knight comics that I have read and talked about and yada yada, I do know like there is some stuff in there of Mr. Knight like hitting people with baseball bats and stuff like that. And I don't know if that was like an intentional reference, but part of me is like, okay, well, if Steven ever does manage to come back from the Duat. Clearly he's a little bit more inspired and confident now, and he's out here like swinging baseball bats, which makes me feel like we might see that Mr. Knight in the future. Suited up a little less like, oh, like I don't know how to fight people, and a little bit more like I'm gonna hit you in the head with a baseball bat and like take them out. So like I feel confident that they are building towards. I mean, it's already really good, and I feel confident that they're building towards something um even closer to what people want from this character and the future of this character and everything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think to the Stephen point, and you mentioned like early on in this video that in theory, like Stephen could be gone forever, and then Jake kind of is the other personality. I That's an interesting idea. I wouldn't mind it, but it's
I'm not
especially
saying that I'm rooting for that idea, but I could see
I
them
haven't
doing it.
thought of that possibility honestly, because it would be taking away Mr. Knight, which I think I
Yeah.
don't imagine they want to do. But to be fair, if maybe Oscar Isaac or Marvel like plan on him continuing in a team up setting, maybe they don't want a lot of like extra stuff going on. I don't know, but yeah. So Steven, I think with the whole episode and like coming to terms with the fact that he is the personality, um, he has a better sense of okay, like I'm a part of this bigger thing, and this bigger thing fucks shit up. Like it's a superhero, he beats people up, he kills people, as we know, and that was very dark. And I thought it was Jake at first. I thought like so many times in the episode I walked in on something and I'm like, Jake, it just never was. Like when Mark early on was not letting Steven see that final memory on the street after the mom passed away, I was like, at first it seemed like Mark didn't remember it either. I'm like,
Yeah, I
Jake
actually
never
said
what?
out loud.
No.
I
But
was like, "Oh, is that Jake?" Because he was next to a car, and I'm like, maybe that's like his cab car or something. And he was like drinking liquor, and I was like, I don't know, it feels like a Jake thing to do. And yeah, and then they revealed it to still be Mark, and I was like, God, it keeps not being Jake.
yeah, I will say, Tower's quote with the hearts at first is that they were incomplete and not full, and the incomplete makes me think third one would be helpful. So the fact that they did bounce very last minute seemed like it was because of Steven. Me overthinking it, things it can't be. But I don't know. It will be interesting what they do with Jake. Because I think he will get a dramatic reveal. I don't know if it'll be in the last 30 seconds. I don't know if it'll be in the first 30 seconds. Maybe never.
I would hope. Um, I guess another question I have for you is there anything else in this episode that like stuck out to you as being like, oh, this is a cool thing from the comics, or oh, this feels like set up for something else down the future that we haven't talked about yet? Because there are some things in these episodes that to me feels like, oh, this might be some sort of reference or something happening down the line, but I'm not as sure as you might have been as being our resident expert.
Yeah, but I mean, there are a few things, and a lot of them are kind of like Bushman, like he could still be out there. This is the character from comics, you know. But I mean, one thing I thought was interesting, I just thought when you were asking that question, is when Khonshu is saving, resurrecting Mark and becoming Moon Knight, Khonshu keeps saying, "Hey, your mind looks rough. It is broken. It is fractured. You sound like a great candidate for this." That's very Lemurian in the whole Khonshu trying to break his already broken mind. That he chose him because of his broken mind to like.
Right.
Even tells Mark he's taking advantage of you. So I think that's setting up maybe a similar, my theory originally, Khonshu thing. The brother, Mark, did have a little brother in the comics, and he became a super villain. A lot of his stories were really over dramatic, and like people like that. But I was reading them like, whoa, like. But Randall Specter and he becomes Shadow Knight, and Shadow Knight essentially is motivated by he wants to become Moon Knight in a lot of ways, and there's kind of weird convoluted ways he at one point thinks he is, and things like that. But so what's interesting is since the brothers seem to die, obviously, and I do not believe they said Randall at any time for the name of that little brother in the series, but presumably he didn't have a bunch of other brothers in the museum. So if that character is dead in the MCU, that could imply it's not a character that's going to come back later. Or someone else is going to be it. But I don't know. At a certain point, like, you really force other characters in other people. But
I don't know.
I mean, it's.
Mark's in the afterlife now. Maybe he finds his little brother and pulls him.
Yeah, I don't think he's like. I mean, it's his brother. The thing in the comics, it's his brother. Like that adds a whole other thing to it. So if it's just like another guy being Shadow Knight, it's not going to be as impactful. Mark does kill Randall Specter eventually. He may come back 82 times, but he does kill him at one point. But obviously, they're later.
Maybe there's been a lot of undead people in this series. Mm-hmm. And maybe in a potential season 2 or 3 or whatever they have planned for this character, maybe they do said doo-doo. Maybe they do Shadow Knight, but within the MCU, Shadow Knight is some sort of like undead apparition or villain or something, and then the drama in that conflict comes from Shadow Knight also blaming Mark, and then Mark having to like, again, literally and physically, like literally and metaphorically, take on his like biggest trauma.
Yeah.
Who was like saying to him in the same way that his mom did, like, "This is your fault" or something along those lines.
Yeah, honestly. I mean, it's possible.
Interesting.
But that isn't there. There's one other thing I thought of when you asked that question. And I do not remember what it was. If I think of it, I'll mention it. But, I mean, there are a lot of little things. Like, I mean, and we already talked about, like, they reveal, I think, for the first time that he is Jewish. And, like,
right.
That's a big deal. It is pretty subtle, you know, it's visual more than anything else. But that I do think that was the first time. I do not remember that any other time in the series. So that's from the comics. But
are his troubles with his parents a thing in the comics? Like, does he like in this? I'm sure they're more of a thing, but is that like something that is an element?
Yes. He has more problems with his dad in the comics because of his DID mostly. I mean, it kind of depends on the run you're on and some flashbacks, but more recently, in the same run that we discovered his past and the origin of that. Yeah, he has more problems with his dad, who's a rabbi. And his dad clearly is like kind of ashamed of him for that. They kind of sent him to like an institution when he was pretty young. And there is a scene in the comics, I can picture it, that after his dad died, he goes to the kind of funeral we kind of saw in the series through the episode, and it's his mom who's the one saying, like, Mark at some point goes, "This isn't Mark anymore, this is Jake." She's like, "No," he's like, "You're right, I'm sorry, that's not how it works." But, yeah, so I mean, there are some parallels there, but it was the dad, not the mom in the comics. Generally speaking, they don't talk about his mom much in the comics and his dad a little bit. But yeah,
Well, I feel like at that point we've mostly covered all of the breakdown stuff that we can really break down um, in this episode. I mean, we covered through his past. We covered the stuff on the boat. The psych ward being. Oh, one thing we can talk about. I really like the concept that the uh the the inside of the boat is just it presents itself to anybody as like what makes the most sense to them, which is a thing that we've heard in comics like a bunch of times, just that like the human brain can only conceive so much, so we have to create these like constructs that seem familiar to us so that we can understand it. It is interesting to me that Mark, maybe just because he thinks of himself as crazy, would construct like a psych ward inside of that, but I do think that that was a really good and interesting explanation for why it looks that way inside the boat. And I think all that was so cool. I mean, especially when they like were looking in different doors and it was like scenes from earlier in the show. The one door being Mark as Moon Knight like beating down the Jackal, and the other one being Steven as Moon Knight turning back the sky and all of that sort of stuff. I thought all that looked really cool, and it was a very interesting explanation for all of that.
Yeah, yeah. I think they were able to take a lot of. Lemire Run's very popular. I think a lot of people who read Moon Knight, like that's what they read, which is fine, and it's very good. I love it. But they took that and put it in the show, at least in a lot of ways, without having to take on that Rex plot, which is a lot. It wouldn't have fit, at least going into episode 5, it would have been too much in my opinion. So I do like how they were able to pretty organically like make that happen in the series without just doing it. I do think that is cool. Yeah, it kind of made me wonder if Mark had been to in like a mental institution before.
Right.
Um,
It made me wonder that as well.
and I mean, if it is like the comics, maybe when he was younger, they try to send him to an institution or something, but they don't talk about that, so I don't know.
I think it's Dr. Harrow who mentions like that Mark came to the mental institution after his mom died or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like he mentions like, oh yeah, remember like your mom's death is like the first after that is the first time you came here or something along those lines. And it makes me wonder if like that is partly true, that like because we see when he remembers his mom's funeral and everything that he has that like full on mental breakdown walking away from it. So it is possible that that happened and he like checked himself into a mental ward afterwards. Um, I did think it was my roommate pointed out that Mark is the one who thinks that his like Mark knows that he's crazy, and Mark is always the one saying like, "Oh, we're crazy," and Steven's the one who's like, "No, no, no, like we're completely sane." But then in that scene, like Mark has the mental breakdown, and then when he turns to Steven, Steven is the one who immediately like doesn't dial a number, opens his phone, and starts talking to no one, and like never at any point is like, "Oh, I'm crazy."
Yeah, I thought that was interesting because a lot of the times I thought early on it was like to a voicemail or
Right.
something to his mom, but and I've watched
It
it
was like
several times now,
conversing.
he seems to be talking back to what he seems to hear in that situation. Like it doesn't really make sense that it's one way completely
Right.
based on how he acts. And so I thought that was interesting
And
too. We hadn't seen him do that.
on top of that, another thing I was thinking about was that Steven is then looking around. He's looking at street signs, trying to like figure out where he is, and I'm assuming he assumes that he's in London,
Mhm.
but he's in Chicago. And I'm like wondering at what point does he realize that he's in Chicago and have to like fly back to
Yeah,
London, and then like does he never talk
yeah,
about that again or think about it again? And on top of that, Steven mentions remembering parts of his childhood and like the bedroom and stuff, right? And there's like Chicago Cubs posters up in that bedroom. So did Steven think that that bedroom was in London and he was just a big fan of like Chicago sports for some reason? Like these are all things I was thinking about. I'm like, it's very selective memory, and I don't know how that works for people who like have actual DID or if that's like even a thing. But yeah, that I thought that was kind of funny.
it is interesting because I mean in the comics like they all know about each other. There's not like
Right.
yeah. So I mean, but to your point, yeah, he does think he's in London because when he's walking across the street, he's like, oh, they're on the wrong side of the road.
Yeah.
So yeah, that is interesting. Like just kind of almost the technical aspects of how that happens, and maybe that's just suspension of disbelief kind of thing. And I mean, the director said like as much as we try to respect like DAD, do what we can. Like it's still a show. Like it's still a superhero show. Please don't. Like.
Yeah, I don't expect them to like spend time in the finale like explaining that or anything. Yeah. I thought it was really funny that like the amount of things that Steven that should have been humongous red flags for Steven, and he just like never connected with it, and at no point did he think he was insane. He just thought he had this like crazy sleepwalking thing going on. I'm just like, dude, you did not sleepwalk to Chicago, Illinois. Like it's not what happened.
The comic thing. Also very brief reference. He says to Steven at some point when they're walking around, like, apparently going into a fugue state will get you kicked out of the military or the Marines, or like forget in the comic it's Marines. I don't know if it was in the series. And he goes, so was also in the comic that there was a fugue state. In the comics, it does not seem like it's a different personality doing anything. It's like he's just kind of out of it. But I thought that could be Jake.
Yeah, I mean, I could picture Jake pop. I like how so much of this is just us being like, well, it's this, and this is probably Jake, and then the show's never going to give us Jake, and we're just going to look stupid. But yeah, I mean, that would make sense that he blacked out during like a stressful firefight or something, and Jake took over and just did some like nasty stuff and got him kicked out.
It will be interesting if they do show him, because they changed Steven a lot. Obviously, for this show. So they could do that with Jake. For all we know, he's like the, dog breeder.
It's funny.
It seems like they're setting up the violent guy for a lot of reasons.
I'll be curious if Jake Lockley does show up. Like, where does that? Because we were given like a place that the Stephen Grant personality came from. Mm-hmm. But where does Jake Lockley come from? Yeah. Because, like, at what point... Because if Steven was created as, like, the intelligent personality to protect him from abuse, Jake has to be, like, also to protect him from something, but in the reverse way. Like, the guy who's got to, like, get it done in ways that Mark's not comfortable doing. Like, the guy who is Bushman. Like his Bushman personality, I guess, per se.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the best arguments for maybe Jake is being developed at the time we're watching the series and kind of becomes a thing maybe next episode, right? And so I don't, again, not the biggest fan of that necessarily. When I watched it, that's what we're doing. It's great, but I think that's a good argument for that's why a lot of stuff.
I mean,
the way it is, because why doesn't Mark know about him? Or he seems not to. To be fair, he seems like he doesn't.
Barry, I'm going to put my first Jake Lockley theory out here. Okay, here's my theory. Jake Lockley, like you just said, right? Maybe all of this, like this whole experience is developing, he has been developing a Jake Lockley personality, and Mark and Steven clearly aren't aware of it. And maybe Jake has popped in and out. I mean, we've seen evidence of that, but they don't know. Maybe he's not fully developed. I don't know. I don't know how this last episode is going to play out, yada, yada, yada. But maybe Jake Lockley is, like, if Steven is gone, right? And, like, I had that theory earlier of, like, maybe Steven is gone and he needs a different personality, or Steven's gone for a little bit and he needs a replacement for a little bit. I don't know. But, yeah, I mean, maybe he comes back from the dead somehow. Again, who knows? And he does end up in another situation where, like, he has to protect himself and he has to do some things he's not comfortable doing. And he's not there. Steven's not there for him to, like, turn that on and maybe find, like, a more intelligent solution out or something. So his only other option is to develop a new personality who's going to get him out of that situation by any means necessary. And boom, that's where Jake Lockley is. And, I mean, he probably doesn't want to go back to Chicago at the end of all of this because, family and whatnot. I don't know what's going to happen with Layla. If Steven's gone, he doesn't have a life in London anymore. So, like, that's not a thing. So he doesn't go back to London. So, I mean, maybe at the end of the show, when all is said and done, he moves to New York, or he moves to somewhere where he can live like a low-key life for a little bit after all of this goes down. He grows a mustache to protect his identity for a little bit, and then boop, like the Jake Lockley personality pops out, and that's like his new life, and that's where we leave him off at the end of this series.
I,
This is my new
I,
theory.
yeah, no, I think it's. I thought about that. Like that's where the series kind of ends with Jake, and it's kind of this
Yeah,
other serious. Oh, it's just who he is now, kind of thing. I think that's interesting, but there are so many loose ends to tie up with Jake in general, and with that, if there's not a season two, and it seems like if they were making this to be a limited series, but it not stays that way, that something would be more definite. But I don't know. That's why it's. I don't know.
well, that feels like a good place to to maybe close off our long Jake Lockley discussion. Um, great. Well, if you don't have anything else you want to talk about, I feel like we can close up this
Yeah.
week's episode of the Universal Church of Truth. Um, I have been one half of your host, Hunter. This has been the other half, whatever.
Mary.
Mary.
That.
Yay. If you guys didn't figure that out by now. Um, Yeah, only thing else I have to say is check out Murphy's Multiverses coverage of the NFL draft, of the sports going forward. We have a lot of really talented writers writing a lot about sports, NBA, NFL, all that sort of stuff. So that should be really fun. Please check it out, and go Bills.